In the cold wind of a rainy night, a German shepherd crosses the wet courtyard to an isolated chapel. Inside, a small coffin is watched over by a silent family while the dog stands beside it. Without barking, it growls softly and rests its snout. On the closed lid, a nanny in the background looks away and tries to slip away to the side. The mother trembles as she feels a slight movement under the hand resting on the wood. The father holds her arm, tense, preventing any action. But the dog, now motionless, fixes its eyes on the coffin's latch, and for a second, everything stopped. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. Chapter 1. The Vigil. The deep, guttural barking of the German shepherd echoed through the walls of Millfield Community Chapel, cutting through the heavy silence that hung over the memorial service. The small white casket rested on a table, covered with pale flowers, while friends and relatives, heads bowed, murmured words of comfort to one another. Max, the family dog who was accustomed to roaming freely throughout the Mitchell household, now seemed to have a single purpose: to remain motionless beside the casket, growling low whenever someone approached too closely. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front pew, her hands trembling as she clutched her 3-month-old son, Tommy's favorite stuffed elephant. The soft blue fabric was worn from constant handling, and she pressed it against her chest, as if it could somehow fill the emptiness that consumed her. David, her husband of 6 years, sat rigidly beside her, his jaw clenched as he tried to maintain composure for the dozens of community members who had gathered to pay their respects. Many of the attendees, clearly uncomfortable with Max's persistent behavior, exchanged worried glances and whispered among themselves that this was simply the reflection of a mute grief that even animals feel when they lose someone they love. But there was something about the dog's insistence that few dared to face directly. The German shepherd had been Tommy's constant companion since the day they brought the baby home from Millfield General Hospital. Max would lie beside the crib, alert to every sound, every movement, as if he understood his role as protector. Pastor Williams, a kind man in his 60s who had served the small Nebraska community for over 2 decades, tried to continue with the service despite the ongoing disruption. "We gather here today, not in despair, but in hope," he began, his voice competing with another round of sharp barks from Max. "Tommy Mitchell touched our lives in his brief time with us, and though he has been called home too soon, we know that love never truly leaves us." Rebecca Thompson, the young woman who had been caring for Tommy for the past 3 months, stood near the back of the chapel. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple black dress that seemed too large for her petite frame. She had arrived in Millfield from Colorado just before taking the position with the Mitchell family, claiming she needed a fresh start after completing her childcare certification. Now, as she watched the service unfold, her hands fidgeted with the strap of her purse, and her eyes darted nervously toward the exits. In the initial moments of the service, the Mitchell family had interpreted Max's behavior as a silent protest, a refusal to accept the unexpected departure of the baby he had so lovingly watched over. As the hours advanced, however, the discomfort became impossible to ignore. Frank Morrison, a neighbor who had helped organize the memorial, mentioned having seen lights on in the Mitchell house at an hour when everyone was supposedly sleeping, but he was promptly silenced by David's father, who said there was no room for rumors amid so much suffering. The elderly Mr. Mitchell, a retired farmer with weathered hands and steel-gray hair, had been the pillar of strength the family desperately needed. He had made all the arrangements, contacted the chapel, and ensured that everything proceeded according to tradition. "We need to focus on celebrating Tommy's life," he had told his son firmly, "not on speculation and gossip." But the seed of doubt had already been planted, especially in the mind of Margaret Collins, Sarah's sister, who had driven down from Omaha the moment she heard the news. Margaret was a nurse at Nebraska Medical Center, and her trained eye noticed details that others might miss. She observed how Rebecca seemed to avoid making eye contact with family members, how she checked her phone repeatedly, and how she positioned herself near the chapel's side entrance, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. While Max maintained his unwavering vigil, Sarah, exhausted from 3 days of barely any sleep, tried to make sense of the nightmare that had become her reality. Just 4 days ago, she had been planning Tommy's first Christmas, discussing with David whether their son would be old enough to enjoy the twinkling lights on their tree. Now, surrounded by flowers and sympathy cards, she felt as though she was living someone else's life. The baby had been perfectly healthy at his last pediatric appointment with Dr. Robert Henderson, the family physician who had delivered Tommy and had been monitoring his development closely. Dr. Henderson, a respected member of the community who had practiced medicine in Millfield for over 15 years, had found nothing concerning during Tommy's routine 3-month checkup just 2 weeks prior. The infant was meeting all his developmental milestones, gaining weight appropriately, and showing all the signs of a thriving, healthy baby. From time to time, Max would stand up, sniff insistently around the edges of the casket lid, and return to barking as if demanding that someone pay attention to his warning. David, trying to maintain appearances in front of the community, would grip Sarah's arm and ask her to ignore the dog's behavior, assuring her that it was nothing more than a natural reaction from a confused animal who didn't understand what was happening. The chapel, built in 1952 and recently renovated with funds from the community, had hosted countless services over the decades. Its stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the wooden pews, and the smell of fresh flowers mixed with the familiar scent of old wood and furniture polish. On any other day, it would have been a comforting, peaceful place. Today, however, tension filled every corner of the sacred space. Minutes later, Rebecca appeared at the back of the hall, her steps revealing a barely contained urgency that hadn't been there before. As she approached the front of the chapel, she attempted to lure Max away with pieces of food from a small bag she carried, but the animal refused to move. He growled, wagged his tail briefly, but remained there like a faithful guard. This refusal caused some guests to exchange uncomfortable looks, commenting in whispers that perhaps it was time to end the ceremony and allow the family to grieve in private. Tommy's grandfather, a man of firm words and a gaze hardened by decades of farming in Nebraska's harsh climate, was the one who insisted that everything should continue to the end, as custom demanded. "We owe it to Tommy to see this through properly," he declared, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a respected figure in Millfield for over 40 years. A man's memorial service is not something to be cut short because of a dog's confusion. However, even his resolute stance couldn't mask the growing unease that seemed to be spreading through the gathered mourners like wildfire. Women clutched, their purses tighter, men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and several people began glancing at their watches, calculating how much longer they would need to endure this increasingly strange situation. As the afternoon light began to fade, through the chapel's windows, casting longer shadows across the floor, the atmosphere grew more tense. Max's behavior was becoming more agitated, and his barks were growing louder and more frequent. Dr. Henderson, who had been sitting quietly in the middle section of pews, finally stood and approached the Mitchell family. "David, Sarah," he said, softly, placing a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "I think we should consider what might be best for everyone here. Perhaps we could move to a private family moment, just the immediate relatives." But before anyone could respond, Max let out the loudest bark yet, a sound so piercing and urgent that it seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the old chapel. Every conversation stopped, every head turned, and in that moment of absolute silence, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The memorial service had become something else entirely, though none of them could yet understand what that might be. Chapter 2. Unsettling Discoveries. The piercing bark had created a void of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly across the chapel. Margaret Collins felt her nursing instincts kick in as she observed the reactions around her. Years of working in high-stress medical environments had taught her to notice the subtle signs that others might miss, and right now, every alarm bell in her head was ringing. Rebecca Thompson had gone pale at the sound of Max's urgent call, and Margaret watched as the young woman's hand moved instinctively to her purse, clutching it against her side. The movement was quick, almost protective, as if she was guarding something precious or dangerous. Margaret had seen that same gesture countless times in the emergency room when patients or their families were hiding medication, drugs, or other items they didn't want medical staff to discover. "I think I need some fresh air," Rebecca announced, suddenly her voice higher than usual. "This is all so overwhelming." She began moving toward the side door of the chapel, but Max immediately positioned himself in her path, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made several people step back. Dr. Henderson, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing concern, approached the dog cautiously. "Easy, Max," he said in the calm, authoritative voice he used when dealing with frightened animals or anxious patients. "Let's all just take a breath here." But the German Shepherd's attention remained focused entirely on Rebecca, his ears alert and his body tense as if ready to spring into action. Sarah, who had been lost in her own grief, suddenly became aware of the strange dynamic playing out before her. She had hired Rebecca based on excellent references from a childcare agency in Denver, and during the 3 months the young woman had worked for them, she had seemed dedicated and caring. Tommy had appeared comfortable with her, sleeping well during the days. Rebecca watched him while Sarah returned to her part-time job at the local library. But now, as Sarah observed more carefully, she realized there had been small inconsistencies that she had attributed to the adjustment period of having a new caregiver. Rebecca often seemed nervous when David came home early from his job at the agricultural supply store. She had requested to be paid in cash rather than by check, claiming she was having issues with her bank account. And there had been those phone calls she took in hushed tones, always stepping outside or into another room when they occurred. Margaret moved closer to her sister, her professional instincts telling her to pay attention to every detail. "Sarah," she whispered, "when was the last time you actually saw Tommy alert and awake when Rebecca was watching him?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She tried to remember, scanning through the recent weeks, and a cold realization began to settle in her stomach. For the past month, every time she had returned home from work, Tommy had been sleeping. Rebecca had always explained that he had just had his feeding and naturally dozed off, but now that Margaret mentioned it, Sarah couldn't recall a single instance in recent weeks when she had found her son awake and active after Rebecca's shifts. David, overhearing his sister-in-law's question, felt a defensive anger rise in his chest. "Margaret, this isn't the time for speculation," he said firmly. "We are here to honor Tommy's memory, not to question the people who cared for him." But Margaret wasn't backing down. As a registered nurse with over a decade of experience, she had seen too many cases where something that seemed normal on the surface revealed itself to be anything but. "I'm just saying that Max's behavior is highly unusual, and maybe we should consider why he's so agitated." Frank Morrison, the neighbor who had helped with the arrangements, had been quietly observing from the back of the chapel. He was a retired, police officer who had moved to Millfield 5 years ago, seeking the peaceful retirement that small-town life promised. While he no longer carried a badge, his investigative instincts remained sharp. He had noticed Rebecca's nervous behavior, her frequent glances toward the exits, and the way she seemed to be measuring the distance to her car parked outside. As the tension in the chapel continued to build, Frank decided to step outside for a moment, ostensibly to check on the weather, but actually to observe Rebecca's vehicle. The late afternoon sky was gray and heavy with the promise of rain, typical for November in Nebraska. He walked casually toward the parking area, noting that Rebecca's blue Honda Civic had Colorado plates that appeared to be expired. Inside the chapel, Max had finally allowed Rebecca to move past him, but he followed her every step, maintaining a watchful distance that kept everyone on edge. The dog's behavior was so unlike his usual friendly demeanor that even the children in attendance seemed unsettled. Tommy had loved Max, and the dog had been gentle and protective with the baby. From day one, this aggressive vigilance was completely out of character. Rebecca reached into her purse to check her phone again, and this time Margaret caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. Nestled among the typical contents of a woman's purse was a small amber prescription bottle, the kind used for medications, but the label appeared to have been partially torn off. Margaret had handled thousands of such bottles in her career, and something about this one seemed deliberately obscured. "Rebecca," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the authority she had developed during years of dealing with uncooperative patients and family members. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The young woman froze, her hand still in her purse, and for a split second her carefully maintained composure cracked. I really need to get some air," she stammered. "This is just so difficult for everyone." Dr. Henderson, who had been observing the exchange, felt his own suspicions beginning to form. In his years of practice, he had encountered various situations where prescription medications were misused or obtained improperly. The combination of Max's unusual behavior, Rebecca's nervousness, and now Margaret's obvious concern was creating a picture that he didn't like. "Perhaps we should all take a short break," Dr. Henderson suggested diplomatically. "This has been an emotional day for everyone, and maybe some fresh air would be good for all of us." But as the suggestion was made, Max suddenly moved to the casket and placed his front paws on the table beside it, letting out a series of short, sharp barks that seemed almost like a code. The sound was urgent, insistent, and completely different from his earlier vocalizations. It was as if the dog was trying to communicate something specific, something crucial that the humans in the room weren't understanding. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. Throughout her grief, she had maintained the belief that Tommy's sudden passing was a tragedy that no one could have prevented. Dr. Henderson had explained that sometimes infants experience complications that couldn't be predicted or prevented, and she had accepted this explanation because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. But now, watching Max's desperate attempts to communicate, seeing Rebecca's obvious distress, and listening to Margaret's pointed questions, Sarah began to feel a terrible doubt creeping into her mind. What if there was more to Tommy's condition than they had been told? What if her son's peaceful sleep during Rebecca's care hadn't been natural at all? The late afternoon light continued to fade, and the chapel's interior grew dimmer despite the overhead lights. Outside, Frank Morrison was examining Rebecca's car more closely, noting fast food wrappers and coffee cups that suggested recent long-distance travel. On the back seat, partially covered by a blanket, he could see what appeared to be baby items, bottles and formula, which seemed odd for someone whose charge was no longer in her care. Back inside the chapel, the tension had reached a breaking point. Max's barking had become so persistent and urgent that several guests were beginning to suggest that perhaps the service should be postponed until the dog could be removed from the premises. But Tommy's grandfather, despite his earlier insistence. On proceeding was now looking uncertain as he watched his son and daughter-in-law struggle with the growing chaos. Sarah stood up suddenly, surprising everyone. "I want to know what's in that bottle," she said, her voice cutting through the noise and confusion. She was looking directly at Rebecca, and there was a strength in her voice that hadn't been there moments before. Rebecca's face went white, and she took a step backward, bumping into one of the wooden pews. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction, and her hand moved protectively over her purse again. Margaret moved to stand beside her sister, and Dr. Henderson stepped forward as well, creating a semicircle around the young woman. Max, as if sensing that something important was about to happen, sat perfectly still beside the casket, his dark eyes focused intently on Rebecca. For the first time since the service began, the German Shepherd was completely quiet, as if he knew that his urgent warnings were finally being heard. Chapter 3. The Bottle's Secret. The silence in the chapel was deafening as all eyes focused on Rebecca Thompson. Her usually composed demeanor had completely crumbled, and beads of perspiration were visible on her forehead despite the cool November air. Sarah's direct question about the bottle hung in the air like a challenge that could no longer be ignored. "Rebecca," Dr. Henderson said in his most professional tone, "if you have any medication with you, I think it would be appropriate for you to share what it is. Given the circumstances, we need to ensure that everyone's health and safety are accounted for." Rebecca's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and Margaret immediately recognized the signs of someone in acute distress. However, her nursing instincts told her that this wasn't grief or shock, but rather the panic of someone whose secret was about to be exposed. It's just for headaches," Rebecca stammered, but her hand remained protectively over her purse. "I get migraines, and my doctor prescribed something to help." Frank Morrison chose that moment to re-enter the chapel, his expression grim. He had spent the last 15 minutes examining Rebecca's vehicle, and what he had discovered had confirmed his worst suspicions. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the group near the front of the chapel. "Rebecca, I couldn't help but notice that your car has been packed as if you're planning a long trip. There are also some items in there that seem unusual for someone who is no longer working as a caregiver." The color drained completely from Rebecca's face, and she took another step backward, now pressed against the wooden pew with nowhere to retreat. David, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, finally spoke. "What exactly are you all suggesting?" he demanded, his voice tight with a combination of grief and anger. "My son is gone, and instead of mourning him, you're all attacking the person who cared for him during his final weeks." But Sarah was no longer willing to be placated by her husband's desire to avoid difficult questions. The doubt that had been planted in her mind was growing rapidly, fed by the accumulating evidence that something was seriously wrong. "David, look at Max," she said firmly. "Really look at him. When has he ever behaved like this? He's trying to tell us something." The German Shepherd was indeed exhibiting behavior that was completely unprecedented. Max had always been an intelligent and well-trained dog, but his current actions suggested a level of understanding and urgency that went beyond normal canine behavior. He was positioned like a sentinel beside the casket, his eyes moving between Rebecca and the small white box, as if he was guarding something precious. Margaret, drawing on her medical training, decided to press further. "Rebecca, as a healthcare professional, I need to tell you that I recognize the signs of someone who is concealing medication. If you have something that could be relevant to Tommy's condition, you have a moral obligation to share that information." "Tommy's condition," Rebecca repeated, her voice rising in pitch. "He passed away. What condition could he possibly have now?" The words came out too quickly, too defensively, and everyone in the chapel noticed the slip. Dr. Henderson stepped closer, his expression serious. Rebecca, I've been practicing medicine for 15 years, and I've learned to recognize when someone is hiding something that could be medically significant. I'm asking you, as a doctor, and as someone who cares about this family, to show us what's in that bottle. Outside, the threatened rain had begun to fall, creating a steady drumming sound on the chapel's roof that seemed to emphasize the tension inside. The afternoon was growing darker, and the stained glass windows that had earlier cast colorful patterns across the pews now created shadows that made the interior feel more ominous. Tommy's grandfather, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally stood up from his seat in the front row. At 73 years old, he had seen enough of life to recognize when something wasn't right. "Young lady," he said in the authoritative voice that had commanded respect throughout his decades. "As a community leader, these people aren't asking you these questions to be cruel. If there's something that might help this family understand what happened to their boy, then you owe it to them to be honest." Rebecca looked around the chapel desperately, as if searching for an escape route or an ally, but found neither. Nikah, 30 or so people who remained from the memorial service were all watching her with varying degrees of suspicion and concern. Children who had been fidgeting earlier were now sitting perfectly still, sensing the adult tension even if they didn't understand its source. "I don't have to justify myself to any of you," Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I loved Tommy like he was my own child. I would never do anything to hurt him." "Then show us the bottle," Sarah said, standing up and taking a step toward the young woman. For the first time since the memorial service began, Sarah's voice carried the strength and determination of a mother protecting her child. "If it's just headache medication, then you have nothing to hide." Max suddenly let out a low whine, a sound that was different from his earlier barking. It was plaintive, almost heartbroken, and it seemed to communicate a depth of emotion that touched everyone present. The dog's dark eyes were focused on the casket, and for a moment it appeared as though he might be mourning. But then something extraordinary happened. From within the chapel walls, there came a sound so faint that at first only Max seemed to hear it. His ears perked up immediately, and he turned his head toward the casket with an alertness that was unmistakable. A few seconds later, the sound came again, barely audible but definitely present, a soft noise that seemed to be coming from inside the small white box. Dr. Henderson's medical training kicked in immediately. He had heard thousands of sounds during his career, and while this one was muffled and unclear, there was something about it that made his pulse quicken. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked quietly. Sarah's heart began to race as she strained to listen. The chapel had gone completely silent, except for the sound of rain on the roof. And in that silence, the faint noise seemed to echo with enormous significance. "What was it?" she whispered. Margaret moved closer to the casket, her nursing instincts overriding any concerns about propriety. She had heard the sound too, and while she couldn't identify it clearly, there was something about its rhythm and quality that seemed familiar. As a nurse who had worked with infants in the NICU, she had become attuned to the subtle sounds that babies make, even when they're sleeping deeply. "Rebecca," Dr. Henderson said, his voice now carrying a note of urgency that hadn't been there before, "I need you to tell us exactly what medication you've been giving Tommy during your care. And I need you to tell us right now." The young woman's composure finally shattered completely. Tears began streaming down her face, and her hands shook as she reached into her purse. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I was trying to help him. He was so fussy, and his parents were so stressed, and I just wanted everyone to be happy." She pulled out the amber prescription bottle, and even from a distance, Margaret could see that the label had been deliberately damaged. Frank Morrison, with his law enforcement background, immediately understood the significance of a tampered medication label. "What's in the bottle, Rebecca?" Sarah demanded, her voice stronger than it had been in days. It's just something to help him sleep," Rebecca admitted, her words tumbling out between sobs. "A mild sedative. My cousin is a veterinary technician, and she told me that sometimes when animals are anxious, a very small dose can help them relax. I thought maybe it would help Tommy sleep better, and then everyone would be less worried about him." The implications of Rebecca's confession hit the room like a physical blow. Dr. Henderson's face went white as he processed what she had just admitted. Margaret felt her knees weaken as she realized what might have happened to her nephew, and Sarah felt a mixture of horror and desperate hope that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "How much did you give him?" Dr. Henderson asked, his medical training keeping him focused on the critical details. "And when was the last dose?" Max let out another whine, this one even more urgent than before, and positioned himself directly in front of the casket. His behavior had moved beyond protectiveness into something that looked almost like pleading. The dog was no longer just guarding the casket. He was trying to direct everyone's attention to something specific, something that required immediate action. And then, in the silence that followed Rebecca's confession, the sound came again from inside the casket. This time, it was slightly louder and unmistakably recognizable to anyone who had ever cared for an infant. It was the soft, barely audible sigh of a baby who was beginning to wake up from a very deep sleep. Chapter 4. The Awakening. The sound from within the casket was unmistakable now, and Dr. Henderson's medical instincts took over completely. "Everyone step back," he commanded, with the authority of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "Sarah, David, I need you to prepare yourselves. There's a possibility that Tommy is not gone, but rather in a state of deep sedation." Sarah's legs nearly gave out beneath her, and Margaret immediately moved to support her sister. The possibility that her baby might be alive after 3 days of grieving his loss was almost too overwhelming to process. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Rebecca," Dr. Henderson said urgently, turning to the sobbing young woman, "I need to know exactly what medication you gave Tommy, the dosage, and when the last administration occurred. This is now a medical emergency, and every detail could be crucial." Rebecca's face was streaked with tears, and her entire body was shaking. I gave him diphenhydramine," she confessed between sobs. "It's an antihistamine that can cause drowsiness. My cousin said that veterinarians sometimes use it to calm anxious animals before procedures. I thought just a small amount would help him sleep through the night so Sarah and David could get some rest." Frank Morrison, his police training allowing him to remain calm in crisis situations, immediately began coordinating. "Dr. Henderson, what do you need? Should I call for an ambulance?" "Not yet," the doctor replied, his hands moving to the clasps on the casket. "First, I need to assess Tommy's condition. If he's been under sedation for this long, we need to be very careful about how we proceed." Max, as if understanding that his persistent warnings were finally being heeded, backed away from the casket but remained alert and watchful. His tail wagged tentatively, the first sign of happiness he had shown since the memorial service began. The German shepherd's behavior over the past few hours now made perfect sense. He had known all along that something was wrong, that his beloved charge was not gone, but merely sleeping far too deeply. "How could this have happened?" David asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. "Dr. Henderson, you examined him. You said he had passed away." Dr. Henderson's hands paused on the casket clasps as he addressed David's question. When Rebecca brought Tommy to my office 3 days ago, she told me he had suddenly become unresponsive. His pulse was extremely slow, his breathing was shallow, and his body temperature was significantly lowered. All of these are symptoms that can indicate various serious conditions in infants. Without knowing about the sedative, I made the assessment based on the symptoms I could observe. Margaret, her nursing experience helping her process the medical implications, asked the crucial question. Dr. Henderson, if Tommy has been sedated for 3 days, what are the potential complications? That depends on several factors, the doctor replied, carefully opening the first clasp. The type of medication, the dosage, his body weight, and his individual response to the drug. Diphenhydramine can cause prolonged sedation in infants, especially if the dosage was inappropriate for his age and weight. Rebecca's confession continued to pour out between her tears. I only gave him a tiny amount at first, just a few drops mixed in his formula. But when Sarah mentioned that he was still fussy, I thought maybe I needed to give him a little more. I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted to be a good caregiver, to help the family. As Dr. Henderson opened the second clasp, Sarah moved closer despite her fear. She needed to see her son, to know if the impossible hope that was building in her chest might actually be real. The past 3 days had been the darkest of her life, and the possibility that they might have been based on a tragic misunderstanding was both devastating and miraculous. The important thing now, Dr. Henderson said, as he prepared to lift the casket lid, is that if Tommy is indeed alive, but heavily sedated, we need to monitor his vital signs and potentially provide supportive care while the medication clears his system. Tommy's grandfather, who had remained silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke. Doctor, what you're saying is that my grandson might have been alive this entire time, that we've been holding a memorial service for a living child. It's possible, Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Henderson confirmed as he slowly raised the lid of the small casket. Diphenhydramine, especially in inappropriate doses for an infant, can cause a state that mimics many serious conditions. The slowed heart rate, depressed breathing, and reduced body temperature could easily be mistaken for something far more serious. As the lid opened fully, everyone in the chapel leaned forward to see inside. Tommy lay perfectly still, his tiny chest barely rising and falling, but the movement was there. His skin, which had appeared pale and lifeless 3 days ago, still had the subtle warmth of circulation. Most importantly, as they watched, his small lips parted and another soft sigh escaped. Sarah let out a sob that was equal parts grief for the past 3 days and overwhelming joy at the present moment. He's breathing, she whispered, reaching toward her son but stopping short, afraid to disturb him. He's really breathing. Dr. Henderson immediately began his examination, checking Tommy's pulse, respiration, and responsiveness. His vital signs are slow but stable, he reported. His breathing is shallow but regular. This is consistent with heavy sedation rather than any life-threatening condition. Margaret moved to assist the doctor, her medical training invaluable in the current situation. What's our next step? Should we attempt to wake him or allow the medication to wear off naturally? Given that it's been 3 days, the medication should be clearing his system naturally, Dr. Henderson explained. The fact that he's beginning to make sounds suggests that he's starting to emerge from the deepest level of sedation. However, we need to be prepared for the possibility that there could be complications. Frank Morrison had been observing Rebecca throughout the revelation, and his law enforcement instincts told him there was more to her story. Rebecca, I need to ask you directly. Was there any other reason you were giving Tommy this medication? And why did your car appear to be packed for a long trip? Rebecca's sobs intensified, and she collapsed into one of the wooden pews. "I was scared," she admitted, "when I realized that Tommy wasn't waking up. When Dr. Henderson said he had passed away, I knew that everyone would find out what I had done. I was planning to leave town, to go back to Colorado and start over somewhere else." Sarah, who was still staring at her son in disbelief, turned to face Rebecca with an expression of mixed emotions. "You were going to let us bury our living child. You were going to let us believe he was gone forever. Until I didn't know he was still alive," Rebecca protested desperately. "Dr. Henderson said he had died, and I thought it was too late to tell anyone about the medication. I thought it wouldn't matter anymore." David, processing the full implications of what had occurred, felt a rage building inside him, unlike anything he had ever experienced. But before he could speak, Tommy let out a sound that was unmistakably a baby's cry, weak and muffled, but definitely alive. Max immediately perked up at the sound, his tail wagging vigorously for the first time in 3 days. The German shepherd approached the casket cautiously but hopefully, as if he too could hardly believe that his vigilant watch was finally paying off. Dr. Henderson smiled for the first time since entering the chapel hours earlier. "That cry is the best sound I've heard all day," he said. "It indicates that Tommy's neurological functions are intact and that he's beginning to emerge from the sedation." Margaret, tears streaming down her face, looked at Max with newfound respect. "That dog knew," she said with amazement. "He knew all along that Tommy was alive. That's why he wouldn't leave the casket, why he was so agitated every time someone tried to continue with the service." As if understanding that he was being praised, Max let out a single triumphant bark and positioned himself protectively beside the casket once more. But this time, his posture was different. Instead of the frantic urgency he had displayed earlier, he now stood like a proud guardian who had successfully completed his mission. Tommy's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, unfocused but unmistakably alive, before closing again. In that brief instant, Sarah saw the son she thought she had lost forever, and the relief was so profound that she felt as though she might collapse. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," Dr. Henderson announced. "While his condition appears stable, he needs proper monitoring and potentially IV fluids to help flush the remaining medication from his system." As the chapel began to mobilize around the medical emergency, one thing became crystal clear to everyone present. Max, the German shepherd, had just saved Tommy Mitchell's life through 3 days of unwavering determination and an understanding that went far beyond normal canine instinct. The dog, who had been seen as a disruptive nuisance, was actually the hero of the most extraordinary rescue that the small town of Millfield, Nebraska, had ever witnessed. Chapter 5: Recovery and Consequences. The transformation of the chapel, from a memorial service to a medical emergency scene, happened with remarkable speed. Frank Morrison had immediately called for an ambulance, while Dr. Henderson continued monitoring Tommy's vital signs. Margaret assisted with her nursing expertise, and Sarah remained at her son's side, afraid to look away for even a moment in case this miraculous turn of events proved to be a dream. Within 20 minutes, the emergency medical team from Millfield General Hospital arrived at the chapel. The paramedics, Lisa Chen and Robert Martinez, had been briefed on the unusual circumstances during their drive. As medical professionals, they had seen many strange situations, but a baby waking up at his own memorial service was definitely a first. "Dr. Henderson," Lisa said, as she began setting up monitoring equipment, "can you give us a complete rundown of the situation?" Dr. Henderson provided a concise medical summary while the paramedics worked. 3-month-old infant, approximately 72 hours of diphenhydramine intoxication, unknown dosage, but likely significant overdose based on the duration and depth of sedation. Patient is showing signs of gradual emergence with spontaneous breathing, vocalizations, and brief periods of consciousness. Tommy's vital signs, while still slower than normal, were stable and gradually improving. His heart rate was strengthening. His breathing was becoming deeper and more regular, and his body temperature was slowly returning to normal ranges. Most encouragingly, he was beginning to respond to stimuli, turning his head slightly when Sarah spoke to him and making soft sounds when touched. David, who had been struggling to process the emotional whiplash of the past few hours, finally found his voice. "How long until we know he's going to be completely okay?" he asked the paramedics. Robert Martinez, who had 20 years of experience in emergency medicine, provided a cautiously optimistic assessment. "Based on what we're seeing, his body appears to be processing the medication normally. The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical for monitoring, but his responses are very encouraging." As the medical team prepared to transport Tommy to the hospital, attention turned to Rebecca Thompson, who remained in the chapel under Frank Morrison's watchful eye. The young woman had stopped crying, but appeared to be in a state of shock as she realized the full magnitude of what had occurred. "Rebecca," Frank said in the firm but not unkind tone he had perfected during his years in law enforcement, "I need you to understand that there will be legal consequences for what happened here. However, the fact that Tommy appears to be recovering will certainly be taken into consideration." Margaret, despite her anger at what Rebecca had done, couldn't help but feel some sympathy for the young woman who seemed genuinely remorseful. "Rebecca, I need to ask you, did you really not understand how dangerous it was to give diphenhydramine to an infant?" "I thought it was safe," Rebecca sobbed. "My cousin said that vets use it all the time, and I looked it up online. The website said it could be used for children, but I guess I didn't understand about the dosage differences for babies. I just wanted him to sleep better so Sarah and David wouldn't be so tired and stressed." Dr. Henderson, while maintaining his professional demeanor, couldn't hide his frustration. "Rebecca, diphenhydramine affects infants very differently than older children or adults. Their smaller body weight, immature liver function, and developing nervous systems make them extremely susceptible to overdose. What you gave Tommy could have been fatal." The reality of how close they had come to losing Tommy forever hit Sarah like a physical blow. If not for Max's persistent behavior, if not for the questions that Margaret and Frank had raised, if the memorial service had proceeded as planned, Tommy would have been buried alive. The thought was so horrifying that she felt nauseated. As the paramedics loaded Tommy onto a small stretcher designed for infants, Max appeared beside them as if asking permission to accompany his charge to the hospital. The German shepherd's devotion over the past 3 days had earned him the respect and gratitude of everyone present. "I think Max has earned the right to visit Tommy in the hospital," Dr. Henderson said with a slight smile. "Once we have him stabilized, I'll make sure the staff knows that this dog is responsible for saving this child's life." Tommy's grandfather, who had remained relatively quiet throughout the medical emergency, finally spoke to Rebecca with the weight of his 7 decades behind his words. "Young lady, I don't pretend to understand what drove you to make the choices you made, but I want you to know that if my grandson had been buried today, I would have spent the rest of my life making sure you faced the full consequences of your actions." Rebecca nodded miserably, understanding that while Tommy's survival meant she wouldn't face charges related to his passing, she would still need to answer for her reckless endangerment of a child and her subsequent attempt to conceal her actions. The Ambulance departed for the 15-minute drive to Millfield General Hospital, with Sarah riding alongside her son. David followed in the family's pickup truck with Margaret and Max, while Frank Morrison remained at the chapel to secure the scene and take formal statements from the witnesses. Dr. Henderson, who would meet them at the hospital, took a moment to address the remaining people in the chapel. "What happened here today is extraordinary," he said. "A combination of medical knowledge, investigative instincts, and one very intelligent dog prevented a tragedy that would have haunted this community forever." At the hospital, the pediatric team led by Dr. Jennifer Walsh immediately took over Tommy's care. As a specialist in infant medicine, Dr. Walsh had experience with various forms of pediatric poisoning, though she admitted that a case involving a 3-day diphenhydramine overdose was unusual even by her standards. The good news, as Dr. Walsh explained to Sarah and David as they watched Tommy being connected to monitoring equipment, is that his neurological responses appear normal. The medication has likely been metabolizing naturally over the past 3 days, and his body seems to be clearing it effectively. Sarah, who hadn't slept properly in 3 days, found herself afraid to close her eyes for fear that she would wake up and discover this was all a stress-induced hallucination. "When will he be completely back to normal?" she asked. "Every child responds differently," Dr. Walsh replied, "but based on his current improvement rate, I would expect him to be much more alert within the next 12 to 24 hours. We'll keep him under observation for at least 48 hours to ensure there are no complications." Margaret, who had contacted her supervisor at Nebraska Medical Center to explain why she wouldn't be returning to work as planned, stayed at the hospital to provide additional support. Her medical expertise had been invaluable throughout the crisis, and her persistence in questioning Rebecca's behavior had been crucial to uncovering the truth. Max, who had been allowed into the pediatric ward due to the extraordinary circumstances, positioned himself beside Tommy's hospital crib, just as he had beside the casket. The nursing staff, initially skeptical about allowing a dog in the pediatric unit, quickly became admirers of the German Shepherd's gentle vigilance. "I've never seen anything like it," commented Nurse Patricia Holmes, who had worked in pediatrics for 15 years. "That dog somehow knew that baby was alive when none of us did. It's like he could sense something that our medical equipment couldn't detect." As evening approached, Tommy began showing more signs of awakening. His eyes opened for longer periods. He responded to his parents' voices, and he even managed a weak smile when Sarah spoke to him. Each improvement brought tremendous relief to the family and hospital staff who had witnessed one of the most unusual medical cases of their careers. David, finally allowing himself to believe that his son would recover completely, looked at Max with newfound appreciation. "I owe that dog an apology," he admitted to Sarah. "I thought he was just being disruptive, but he was trying to save our son." Dr. Walsh, reviewing Tommy's latest test results, provided the update the family had been hoping for. His blood work shows that the diphenhydramine levels are decreasing appropriately, and all his other indicators are within normal ranges. Barring any unexpected complications, Tommy should make a full recovery. Meanwhile, back at the Millfield Police Department, Rebecca Thompson was being processed and formally charged with child endangerment and reckless conduct. The charges, while serious, took into account the fact that her actions appeared to be the result of ignorance rather than malicious intent, and that Tommy's survival would likely result in a more lenient sentence. Frank Morrison, completing his reports on the incident, reflected on how close the community had come to witnessing an unthinkable tragedy. "In 30 years of law enforcement," he told his wife later that evening, "I've never seen anything like what happened in that chapel today. That dog literally saved a child's life." As night fell over Millfield, the Mitchell family maintained their vigil at Tommy's bedside, watching their son gradually return to them from the deepest sleep of his young life. Max remained at his post, no longer the frantic guardian he had been for 3 days, but still alert and protective, as if he understood that his most important job was far from over. Chapter 6: Healing and Reflection. By the second morning, in the hospital, Tommy Mitchell was almost completely back to his normal, active self. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Where just 48 hours earlier there had been a deeply sedated infant, barely clinging to consciousness, now there was an alert, responsive baby who was eagerly taking his bottle and gurgling happily at the sight of his parents. Dr. Walsh conducted her morning examination with obvious satisfaction. "Tommy's neurological responses are completely normal," she announced to Sarah and David. "His reflexes are appropriate for his age, his muscle tone is good, and he's showing all the developmental behaviors we would expect from a healthy 3-month-old. Sarah, who had barely left Tommy's bedside since arriving at the hospital, felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she watched her son reach for the colorful mobile hanging above his crib. The simple act of seeing him track moving objects with his eyes and attempt to grab at them was a miracle she would never take for granted again. Max, who had become something of a celebrity at Millfield General Hospital, continued his faithful watch from a specially arranged bed beside Tommy's crib. The nursing staff had been amazed by the German Shepherd's behavior, noting that he seemed to relax visibly as Tommy became more alert and active. Several nurses had commented that it was as if the dog could somehow sense his charge's recovery at a level deeper than what human observation could detect. "I've been thinking," David said to Sarah as they watched Tommy batting at a soft toy that Margaret had brought from the hospital gift shop, "about how close we came to making the biggest mistake of our lives. If we had gone through with the burial service." Sarah shuddered at the thought. The idea that they might have buried their living child was so horrifying that she could barely allow herself to contemplate it. "Max saved him," she said simply. "That dog somehow knew when all of us, including the doctors, were wrong." Dr. Henderson, who had stopped by to check on Tommy's progress, overheard their conversation. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in all my years of practice, I've learned that sometimes the most important diagnostic tool isn't found in any medical textbook. Animals have senses and instincts that we're only beginning to understand." Margaret, who had extended her stay in Millfield to help with Tommy's recovery, had been researching cases of animal intuition in medical situations. "I found dozens of documented cases where dogs have detected medical conditions that human diagnostics missed initially," she told them. "There are dogs trained to detect seizures, blood sugar changes, even certain types of cancer. But I've never heard of a case quite like this one." The story of Tommy's rescue had spread throughout the small community of Millfield, and the hospital had been receiving calls and visits from people wanting to know about the baby's condition and the heroic dog who had saved him. Local news stations from Lincoln and Omaha had requested interviews, though the family had politely declined, preferring to focus on Tommy's recovery rather than media attention. Frank Morrison had completed his investigation and submitted his final report to the county prosecutor's office. Rebecca Thompson, who had been released on bail pending her court appearance, would face charges related to child endangerment, but the fact that Tommy had survived and appeared to be suffering no lasting effects would likely result in a sentence focused more on education and community service than incarceration. "Rebecca made a terrible mistake," Frank explained to the Mitchell family during one of his visits to the hospital. "But all the evidence suggests it was born from ignorance rather than malice. She genuinely believed she was helping Tommy sleep better, and she clearly had no understanding of how dangerous diphenhydramine could be for an infant. David struggled with conflicting emotions about Rebecca. While he was grateful beyond words that Tommy had survived, he couldn't forget that they had spent 3 days believing their son was gone forever. "I understand that she didn't mean for this to happen," he said, "but the fact remains that her actions could have cost us our child." Dr. Walsh, who had been monitoring Tommy's progress closely, felt confident enough in his recovery to begin discussing discharge plans. "All of his test results are normal," she reported. "His liver function shows no signs of damage from the medication. His neurological development appears to be right on track, and his physical growth hasn't been affected." The news that Tommy would be coming home soon brought both joy and anxiety to Sarah and David. After what they had experienced, the thought of trusting anyone else with their son's care seemed impossible. They had learned in the most traumatic way possible that their instincts as parents needed to be their primary guide in caring for their child. "I don't think I'll ever be able to hire another babysitter," Sarah admitted to Margaret as they watched Tommy playing contentedly in his hospital crib. "How can I trust anyone else after this?" Margaret, with her professional experience in healthcare, understood Sarah's feelings completely. "It's going to take time," she acknowledged, "but you can't let this experience make you afraid to live normally." What happened with Rebecca was extraordinarily unusual. Most childcare providers are trustworthy and competent. Tommy's grandfather had been a daily visitor to the hospital, and watching his grandson's recovery had given him a new perspective on the entire ordeal. "You know," he told his son during one of their conversations, "I keep thinking about that dog. Max never gave up, even when all of us humans were ready to accept the worst. There's a lesson in that about persistence and trust in our instincts." The bond between Max and Tommy had become even stronger during the hospital stay. Whenever Tommy was awake, he would turn his head toward the sound of Max's movements, and he seemed to calm immediately when the German Shepherd was nearby. The nursing staff had documented that Tommy's vital signs were most stable when Max was present, leading Dr. Walsh to comment that the dog appeared to have a genuinely therapeutic effect on the baby. As Tommy's discharge date approached, the family began planning their return to normal life, though they all understood that normal would be redefined by their recent experience. David had already contacted his employer to arrange for extended family leave, wanting to spend as much time as possible with his son after coming so close to losing him forever. Sarah had made the decision to take an indefinite leave from her job at the library. The idea of being separated from Tommy for any extended period was more than she could handle at the moment. "Maybe in a few months," she told David, "but right now, I need to be with him every minute." The community of Millfield had rallied around the Mitchell family in remarkable ways. Neighbors had brought meals, local businesses had donated items for Tommy's care, and the chapel where the extraordinary events had unfolded had received donations from people across the state who had heard about the story. Pastor Williams had announced that the funds would be used to establish a scholarship for veterinary students in honor of Max's life-saving intervention. Dr. Henderson had been deeply affected by the case as well. The experience of mistakenly diagnosing a living child as deceased, even under the extraordinary circumstances created by Rebecca's actions, had prompted him to research pediatric medication poisoning more extensively. He had already begun reaching out to other medical professionals to share what he had learned and to advocate for better awareness of the signs and symptoms of diphenhydramine overdose in infants. On Tommy's final day in the hospital, Dr. Walsh conducted one last comprehensive examination, "I'm happy to report that Tommy Mitchell is completely healthy," she announced. "His development is progressing normally, and there are no lasting effects from his ordeal. You can take your son home with confidence that he has made a full recovery." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Sarah looked at Max with profound gratitude. The German Shepherd had proven to be more than just a family pet. He had been Tommy's guardian angel, his protector, and ultimately, his savior. "I don't know how we can ever repay you," she said to the dog, scratching behind his ears as he wagged his tail contentedly. Max seemed to understand that his vigil was finally over. As they loaded Tommy into his car seat for the ride home, the German Shepherd settled into the back of the pickup truck with the relaxed demeanor of a job well done. His 3-day mission to save Tommy's life had been successful, and now he could return to his normal role as the family's beloved pet and guardian. The drive home to their small farmhouse outside Millfield was filled with a mixture of emotions. Relief, gratitude, and joy at Tommy's recovery competed with the lingering trauma of what they had all experienced. But as they pulled into their driveway and saw the yellow ribbons that neighbors had tied to their fence posts in celebration of Tommy's homecoming, the Mitchell family knew that they had been given a second chance that few families ever receive. Their ordeal was over, but the lessons they had learned about trust, intuition, and the remarkable bond between humans and animals would stay with them forever. Most importantly, they would never again underestimate the wisdom of Max, the German Shepherd who had refused to give up on the baby he loved, even when everyone else had lost hope. 6 months after the extraordinary events at Millfield Community, chapel life for the Mitchell family had found a new rhythm, one forever changed by their harrowing experience, but strengthened by the miracle of Tommy's survival. The warm Nebraska spring had brought with it a sense of renewal and hope that seemed particularly meaningful to Sarah and David as they watched their now 9-month-old son crawling energetically around their living room, babbling happily and showing no signs of his early ordeal. Tommy had not only recovered completely, but was thriving in ways that amazed his pediatrician. Dr. Walsh, during his 6-month follow-up appointment, had declared him to be in perfect health and meeting all developmental milestones ahead of schedule. "He's a remarkably resilient little boy," she had told his parents with a smile. Whatever protective instincts kept him safe during those 3 days seemed to have made him stronger. Max, now recognized throughout the state of Nebraska as a hero, had adjusted to his new status with the dignity befitting his remarkable achievement. The German Shepherd had received commendations from veterinary associations, animal welfare groups, and even a special recognition from the governor's office. More importantly to him, however, was the fact that Tommy was safe and healthy, allowing Max to return to his favorite activities of playing fetch in the backyard and napping in the sunshine. The bond between dog and baby had grown even stronger, if such a thing were possible. Tommy's first word, to everyone's delight and no one's surprise, had been Max. The baby would giggle with pure joy whenever the German Shepherd entered the room, and Max remained gently protective, positioning himself nearby whenever Tommy was playing on the floor. Sarah had eventually returned to her job at the Millfield Public Library, but only part-time, and only after implementing a childcare arrangement that involved family members exclusively. Margaret had relocated from Omaha to be closer to her sister and nephew, taking a position at Millfield General Hospital that allowed her to help with Tommy's care while pursuing her own career goals. "I never thought I'd leave the big city medical center," Margaret often said, "but after what we experienced, I realized that the most important medicine isn't always practiced in the largest hospitals. Sometimes it's about being present for the people you love when they need you most." Dear friends, we hope that the incredible story of Tommy Mitchell and Max the German Shepherd has moved and inspired you as much as it has touched our hearts. This remarkable tale reminds us of the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals, and the importance of trusting our instincts even when the world tells us otherwise. If this story has captivated you, we invite you to explore our special collection of similar heartwarming narratives that celebrate the courage, loyalty, and intuition that define the best of both human and animal nature. You can find this carefully curated playlist by clicking the link to your left. These stories explore the depths of love, the power of determination, and the miracles that can happen when we listen to our hearts. If Tommy and Max's journey has touched your soul, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity and beauty of life, the bonds that unite us, and the extraordinary moments that remind us of what truly matters. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories of animal intuition, family bonds, and moments of hope are what make our community so special. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and we look forward to sharing many more inspiring tales with you.